All right. So, uh, as a fellow philosopher, you always seem to dig up these really interesting thinkers. And today we're going to be diving into Josiah Royce, a name that I know you've mentioned to me and really piqued your interest. So we've got some excerpts here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Royce. And, well, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there is. I mean, what's so interesting about Royce is that he was such a champion of this idea of absolute idealism, this idea that reality is ultimately unified in a single, all-encompassing consciousness.
Wait, so he's saying that, like, the entire universe is just one big mind. That's a pretty wild claim, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a concept that really challenges our everyday experience of a world full of, separate, distinct things. But for Royce, everything is interconnected. It's interwoven within this mind of a single absolute knower. Think about it in terms of like Hegel and Bradley, these figures who grappled with similar ideas, suggesting that reality is more like a grand interconnected web of thought than just a collection of isolated objects.
Hmm. So if everything is part of this one giant mind, then what happens to individual identity? Do we even exist as separate selves in Royce's view?
That's where things get really interesting, especially when we consider Royce's argument from error. He argued that the very possibility of making mistakes points to the existence of this absolute knower.
Okay. Now you're going to have to explain that one. How does making errors prove the existence of some, like, all-knowing cosmic mind?
Sure. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you're looking for your keys right, but you can't find them. You're mistaken about their location. But to be wrong implies that they're is a right location, a true object, even in your error. Royce argues that this points to a larger mind that holds the complete truth, a mind that encompasses all possible truths and errors.
Hmm. That's a pretty trippy idea. I mean, if we take it to its logical conclusion, it almost suggests that the world, as we experience it, is just a projection of this absolute knower's mind.
Right. Exactly. It challenges the very notion of a world independent of our minds. And it pushes us to reconsider the relationship between our individual consciousness and the ultimate nature of reality.
Now let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Royce the man. I mean, he wasn't just some abstract philosopher locked away in an ivory tower. He had a pretty remarkable life. Started in a remote California mining town and ended up teaching giants like T.S. Eliot at Harvard. That's quite a journey.
It really is. And what's fascinating is how Royce's personal experiences, particularly the tragedies he faced later in life, they seem to have profoundly influenced his philosophical trajectory. He became increasingly concerned with practical ethical matters, seeking ways to ground meaning and purpose in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
And that's where his emphasis on loyalty as the foundation of ethics comes into play, right?
Ah.
He saw loyalty as more than just blind allegiance, but as a way to connect with something larger than ourselves.
Precisely. Royce argued that a truly meaningful life requires commitment to causes greater than oneself, aligning ourselves with communities that share those aims. He believed that through loyalty, we transcend our isolated selves and become part of something larger and more enduring.
But doesn't that raise some potential problems? I mean, loyalty to loyalty could be used to justify all sorts of questionable actions, even harmful ones, couldn't it?
That's a very astute observation. And Royce himself recognized this potential pitfall. He distinguished between genuine communities that uplift and empower their members, and predatory ones that exploit and dominate. He argued that true loyalty is always rooted in a commitment to justice and the well-being of others, a point that's particularly relevant for you as a philosopher.
You're right. Royce's ideas about community and loyalty definitely seem to resonate with some of the contemporary debates in political philosophy.
Indeed. Think about how his notion of community intersects with ideas of individual rights and autonomy. Is there a potential tension there? Could Royce's emphasis on loyalty lead to a kind of ethical conformity that stifles individual expression and dissent? These are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely. Now, Royce wasn't just interested in ethics and community. He also wrote extensively on religion, particularly in his later works.
Yeah, he did. He was particularly interested in this idea of salvation. But for Royce, it wasn't about adhering to specific religious doctrines or rituals. He saw it as a quest for a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe, a journey toward a more profound sense of meaning and purpose.
So he wasn't advocating for a particular religion, but rather exploring the human need for something that transcends our everyday experience.
Exactly. And he saw this need reflected in various religious traditions, particularly in the idea of the invisible church, a fellowship of individuals united by their shared pursuit of truth and goodness. This concept resonates with his vision of the beloved community, an ideal of unity grounded in shared purpose and mutual understanding. It's like he's suggesting that our individual journeys toward meaning are ultimately intertwined, leading us toward a greater sense of interconnectedness and shared purpose.
Interesting. So it sounds like Royce was really trying to bridge the gap between individual experience and a sense of belonging to something larger than ourselves, whether that's a community or a shared purpose or even a connection to some ultimate reality. Now, speaking of Royce's exploration of religious themes, he also tackled some pretty big theological questions in his book, The Problem of Christianity, didn't he?
He did. And what's striking is that he approached these questions in a way that feels remarkably modern. He wasn't fixated on dogma or theological technicalities. He was more interested in the lived experience of faith and how religious communities embody and express those deeper human longings for connection, meaning, and purpose.
So instead of getting bogged down in doctrinal debates, he focused on the spirit of Christianity, particularly as it manifests in the church, which he saw as a model for his beloved community. That's quite a unique perspective, especially for a philosopher writing in the early 20th century.
It really is. He saw the church not just as an institution, but as a living embodiment of the human yearning for connection, for belonging, for a sense of shared purpose that transcends our individual lives. He saw it as a prototype for the kind of beloved community he envisioned. A community where differences are respected, but a shared commitment to the good binds people together.
That's fascinating. But let's face it, the world can be a pretty dark place. How did Royce reconcile his idealistic view of reality, especially this idea of a benevolent absolute knower, with the very real problem of evil? It seems like a tough contradiction to resolve.
It's a question that troubled Royce deeply, especially given his own personal experiences with loss and suffering. He didn't shy away from the reality of evil. He saw it as a genuine force in the world, not just an illusion or a means to a good end.
So how did he explain the existence of evil, if ultimate reality is supposed to be grounded in this all-encompassing benevolent consciousness?
That's where his process metaphysics comes into play. Royce saw reality as constantly unfolding, a dynamic process where both good and evil are intertwined. He believed that even God experiences suffering, feeling the pain of the world alongside us.
So for Royce, it wasn't about denying the existence of evil or trying to explain it away. It was about acknowledging its reality and finding ways to move forward, to create meaning and purpose in a world where suffering is an undeniable part of the human experience.
Exactly. It's a perspective that resonates with existentialist thinkers who grapple with the absurdity and suffering inherent in human existence. He doesn't offer easy answers, but he provides a framework for understanding evil not as something that negates the good, but as a challenge that calls us to deeper levels of compassion, resilience, and commitment to creating a more just and loving world.
Now, we can't talk about Royce without addressing some of the more problematic aspects of his thinking, particularly his views on race and colonialism. I know from our conversations that you've wrestled with these issues yourself.
Yeah, it's a difficult but necessary conversation. Royce was ahead of his time in rejecting the biological racism that was prevalent in his day. He believed that all humans share a fundamental moral worth. But he did hold some views that, from a modern perspective, are undeniably racist.
Such as?
Well, for instance, he believed in the superiority of Anglo-American culture and saw colonialism, at least in some cases, as a civilizing influence.
That's a perspective that's obviously deeply flawed and harmful, especially given the legacy of colonialism and its devastating impact on countless cultures and communities.
Absolutely. It raises challenging questions about how we grapple with the legacy of thinkers whose ideas contain both brilliance and deeply problematic elements. Can we separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak? Can we appreciate Royce's insights into community loyalty and the search for meaning while condemning his ethnocentric biases?
It's a dilemma we often face when engaging with historical figures, especially those who lived in times when certain prejudices were widely accepted. It's a reminder that even brilliant minds can be products of their time, and that critical engagement requires us to acknowledge both the strengths and limitations of their thinking.
Exactly. It's a call for intellectual humility and nuanced understanding.
Now, shifting gears a bit, Royce was also deeply interested in logic, and he even developed his own system, which he called System AN. What was that all about? Was he trying to revolutionize the way we think about logic?
In a way, yes. Royce saw logic as more than just a set of rules for constructing arguments. He viewed it as the science of order, a way of understanding the fundamental structures and patterns that shape our world.
Okay, but how did his system differ from traditional approaches to logic?
Well, for Royce, the basic elements of logic weren't propositions as in traditional systems, but modes of action. Instead of just focusing on the truth or falsity of statements, he wanted to analyze how our actions change what's possible in the world.
So it's almost like he's saying, let's not just think about what's true. Let's think about how our choices and actions shape the very fabric of reality. That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
Exactly. For Royce, logic wasn't just an abstract system. It was deeply connected to our lived experience, to the choices we make, and the consequences that ripple out from those choices.
Can you give me an example of how this modes of action approach works in practice? I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around it.
Sure, imagine you're at a crossroads, and you have to choose between path A and path B. By choosing path A, you close off the possibility of taking path B. This choice, this action, changes the structure of possibilities in your world. That's what Royce is trying to capture with his modes of action.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to his emphasis on choice and action in his ethics. He seems to be saying that our ethical choices aren't just abstract pronouncements, but actions that have real consequences, actions that shape the world around us.
Precisely. And he used these modes of action as building blocks in System Make, incorporating operations like negation, exclusive disjunction equivalence, and a special relation he called the O relation to represent incompatible actions.
Hold on, back up a second. What exactly is this O relation?
It essentially captures the idea that choosing one action from a set of incompatible actions eliminates the possibility of choosing any of the others. For example, if you choose to tell the truth, you can no longer choose to lie in that same situation. The actions of truth-telling and lying are incompatible, and choosing one eliminates the possibility of the other.
That makes sense. But where does the F relation come in? I remember you mentioned that earlier.
Ah, the F relation. This is where Royce gets even more intricate. He uses the F relation to represent the relationship between an antecedent and a consequent, essentially capturing the idea of cause and effect.
So it's like he's introducing time and consequence into his logical system. He's not just analyzing static propositions, but he's looking at how actions unfold over time and create chains of cause and effect.
Exactly. And this ties back to his process metaphysics, this idea that reality is a dynamic, ever-unfolding process. He sees logic as a way to map the contours of this process, to understand how our choices and actions contribute to the ongoing flow of events.
Now, I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking this all sounds fascinating, but it also seems incredibly complex. What's the relevance of Royce's system, Vol, for someone who's not a logician? How does it impact our understanding of philosophy as a whole? What would you say to that?
That's a great question. For a fellow philosopher like you, I think the real value lies in exploring the potential connections between Royce's ideas and more contemporary developments in logic and philosophy.
You mean like modal logic game theory or even the philosophy of action?
Precisely. Does Royce's focus on modes of action anticipate ideas that are being developed in these fields today? Could his system offer new insights into the relationship between logic, action, and the structure of reality? These are questions that I think would be worth exploring further.
I agree. Royce's work often feels like a treasure trove of ideas waiting to be rediscovered and reinterpreted in light of contemporary philosophical debates. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here. From Royce's absolute idealism and his theories on community and loyalty to his intricate and often challenging system, it's clear that he was a thinker who grappled with some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and the ethical challenges we face as individuals and as a society. It's clear that he was a thinker who grappled with some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and the ethical challenges we face as individuals and as a society. But as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Royce's world, I'm left with this nagging question. He may not be a household name like some of the other philosophical giants, but his ideas about community loyalty and the search for meaning seem more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, I totally agree. We live in a world that's grappling with so much division, polarization, and a sense of fragmentation. And Royce's call for this beloved community, grounded in shared values, mutual understanding, and a commitment to the common good, it feels like such a needed antidote to the cynicism and isolation that we see so much of these days.
Yeah, you're right, it does. But at the same time, given the state of the world, with all its conflicts and complexities, Royce's vision also feels a bit, well, idealistic. I mean, is it really possible to achieve this kind of unity and understanding in a world that seems increasingly fractured?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, I think it's one that Royce himself would have wrestled with. He was a realist as well as an idealist. He understood the challenges, the deep-seated divisions, the conflicting loyalties that pull us in different directions.
So where does that leave us? Is Royce's vision of the beloved community just a utopian dream? A noble aspiration, but ultimately unattainable? Or could it serve as a guiding principle, like a compass pointing us toward a more just and humane future, even if we never fully reach that ideal?
That's the challenge he throws down to us, especially, I think, to philosophers who are trying to engage with the real complexities of the world we live in. He doesn't offer easy answers or simplistic solutions. He really pushes us to think deeply about the nature of community, the power of loyalty, and the possibility of finding meaning and connection in a world that often feels fragmented and chaotic.
So it's not about achieving some perfect state of unity, but rather about striving towards a more just and compassionate world, recognizing our interconnectedness, and finding ways to bridge the divides that separate us.
Exactly. He reminds us that we're not just isolated individuals adrift in a sea of meaninglessness. We're part of this larger web of relationships, communities, and shared aspirations. And while achieving a beloved community might be an ongoing process, a continuous striving rather than a fixed destination, it's still a goal worth pursuing.
And maybe in the process of striving towards that ideal, we discover something really profound about ourselves, about our capacity for empathy, compassion, and connection. It's a thought-provoking challenge. And I think Royce would be pleased to know that we're still grappling with his ideas all these years later.
I think you would too. And, he'd probably encourage us to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep striving to make his vision of a more just and loving world a reality.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of Josiah Royce. It's been a fascinating and challenging journey, and we hope you found it enlightening as well. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those connections that bind us together.
And you know what else is really interesting about Royce is that he was also really into logic. Like, he even developed his own system of logic,
Huh?
which he called system.
Oh, wow. Okay, so tell me more about that. What was he trying to do with this system? Was he trying to, revolutionize the way we think about logic?
In a way, yeah. Royce saw logic as being more than just, a set of rules for constructing arguments. He saw it as the science of order, a way to understand the fundamental structures and patterns that shape our world.
Okay, but how is his system different from traditional approaches to logic?
Well, for Royce, the basic elements of logic weren't propositions like in traditional systems, but what he called modes of action. So instead of just focusing on, the truth or falsity of statements, he wanted to analyze how our actions change what's possible in the world.
So it's almost like he's saying, let's not just think about what's true. Let's think about how our choices and actions shape the very fabric of reality. That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
Yeah, exactly. For Royce, logic wasn't just some abstract system. It was deeply connected to our lived experience, to the choices we make and the consequences that come from those choices.
Can you give me an example of how this modes of action approach works in practice? I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around it.
Sure. Imagine you're at a crossroads, right? And you have to choose between path A and path B. By choosing path A, you close off the possibility of taking path B. So this choice, this action, it changes the structure of what's possible in your world. And that's what Royce is trying to capture with his modes of action.
Okay, I see. So I'm starting to see how this connects back to his emphasis on choice and action in his ethics. Like, he seems to be saying that our ethical choices aren't just these abstract pronouncements, but they're actions that have real consequences, actions that shape the world around us.
Precisely. And he used these modes of action as the building blocks for his system, incorporating operations like negation, exclusive, disjunction, equivalence, and a special relation that he called the O relation to represent these incompatible actions.
Wait, hold on, back up for a second. What's this O relation?
Well, the O relation basically captures the idea that if you have a set of actions that are incompatible with each other, choosing one of those actions eliminates the possibility of choosing any of the others. So, for example, if you choose to tell the truth, you can't then choose to lie in that same situation because those two actions, truth-telling and lying, they're incompatible. Choosing one eliminates the possibility of the other.
Okay, that makes sense. But you mentioned the F relation before. Where does that come in?
The F relation. This is where things get even more intricate with Royce. He uses the F relation to represent the relationship between an antecedent and a consequent. So essentially, it captures the idea of cause and effect.
Oh, so it's like he's introducing time and consequence into his logical system.
Mm-hmm.
He's not just analyzing these static propositions,
Yeah.
but he's looking at how actions unfold over time and create these chains of cause and effect.
Exactly. And this ties back to his process metaphysics, his idea that reality is this dynamic, ever-unfolding process. He sees logic as a way to kind of map the contours of that process, to understand how our choices and actions contribute to the ongoing flow of events.
And I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking like, whoa, this is really fascinating. But it also seems pretty complex. What's the relevance of all this for someone who's not a logician? How does Royce's system impact our understanding of philosophy more broadly?
That's a great question. For a fellow philosopher like yourself, I think the real value lies in exploring how Royce's ideas connect to some of the more contemporary developments in logic and philosophy.
You mean like modal logic, game theory, or even the philosophy of action?
Exactly. Does Royce's focus on modes of action anticipate some of the ideas that are being developed in these fields today? Could his system offer us new insights into the relationship between logic action and the structure of reality? These are questions that I think would be really worth exploring further.
I agree. It's like Royce's work is this treasure trove of ideas just waiting to be rediscovered and reinterpreted in light of all the current philosophical debates. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from Royce's absolute idealism to his theories on community and loyalty to his very intricate system ethic. It's clear that he was a thinker who really wrestled with some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and the ethical challenges that we face as individuals and as a society. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Josiah Royce. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you've enjoyed it as well. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for those connections that bind us together.